Building soil. This is one of the most critical activities, and the wonderful thing is there's so many different ways you can do it. You can stack how you do it, you can combine different processes, you can become really good at one way of doing it, or 3 ways, or 10 ways. It all really just depends on what works for you in your climate and your area. So first, we're going to talk about mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi, as we talked with, partners with the roots, and it allows the roots to expand their surface area. So it covers them and allows them to have way more surface area, sometimes increases nutrient absorption 10,000 times. And so it's absolutely crazy how powerful these actually are in situ. So matching the right mycorrhizal fungi, whether it's endo or ecto, with that plant is going to be the key. If you look on the packaging, it'll say, the ecto, remember, is really for like timber and like nut trees only. So endo is your fruit trees, your vegetables, your annuals, even your perennials, but the bushes, you know what I mean, not the ecto. So, and then there is specific stuff for like blueberries and certain really high acidic soil fungi. They have very specific, I want to say Araquat or something like that, but that's wrong. It's an E word though. So these associations are amazing, but you can't kind of guarantee that they work if you try to water it in later on. And it could work, totally could work. Maybe you like pitchfork or broad fork and then water it in. I've done that before and had success. But for the most part, it's most ideal when you've got the bare root plant and you hit it with the mycorrhizal inoculant, and then you plant it right then and there. And so those associations are in there. Then you dress the top with wood chips or something like that, or a mulch, so that it's got everything it needs in space, right in that space. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to inoculate your seeds. You can literally have it in a little bit of water, or have your seeds slightly damp, and then put it into a dust bath or something like that, but you're trying to coat the seeds, and then you're sowing your seeds. Or you could put it into a compost tea, and then have that raise up inside the compost tea, and then apply it. Really depends on what you're trying to do. A foliar spray, or trying to soak it into the ground, or trying to really like reach those root hairs and start an association. We're going to be modeling how to do this. We're going to be talking about this. We're going to be doing how-tos. It's going to continue. So this is just introducing all these concepts. How-tos are later on down in this week. Next is crop rotations, or not. because if you've listened to what Elaine Ingham talks about, she has been able to make it so that you don't have to rotate crops. Now, there's probably histories and hidden histories and family histories around crop rotation throughout all time. And so they would be using legumes, they would be using rest, and because the surrounding forest with that, indigenous microorganisms inoculating it during that rest period, it was able to recover. So they're able to put back, using legumes, some of that nitrogen, but it really was that rest period. Now, fast forward in time, you've got no woods and you're resting your field, and going fallow doesn't do anything anymore. It doesn't have the same effect because it's not surrounded by the same microbiology in close proximity. So crop rotations can really help avoid depletion, but there are crop rotation examples that Elaine's talked about where they've had to expand every time they go back to that plant. So it's been 10 years between tomato plantings, and every time they do it, just destroys the soil. And so she was able to make it so that they could just always do tomatoes, that they did not need to rotate ever again. So the situation that was getting out of control, she was able to just completely reverse and put it completely into their hands, because she was able to unlock the minerals, the non-soluble nutrients in the clay, the silts, the sand. And that is really so powerful. I know that Jean-Martin Fortier relies heavily upon, and we'll talk about that in the gardening and food forest section, about how he has a 10-year rotation for crops, and it's very intensive. He uses compost, he uses heavy feeders and light feeders. He has a very, very articulated system. And I think if you're doing all of that and you're bringing in the biology, maybe you could get to another level. I don't know, but I think that there's a capacity. I mean, they're going to get everything they need if they're in full communication. And just like if there's enough nitrogen, nodulation doesn't happen. Just like if there's enough water, they stop drinking. You know what I mean? They drown, right? Eventually. So there's capacities for all things. So I just think that crop rotation might not be necessary. And then if you use polycultures, and how does this build soil? Well, it doesn't deplete soil, so it returns to the soil nutrients. And then crop rotations usually had that fallow, or they had an amendment as part of it. So you could do that, or you could do a combination, or you could not do that. You could do polycultures even that are in situ feeding the soil, and you're chopping and dropping and feeding the life right there. That's what I did, and we'll talk more about that later. That really relates to the next thing, which is green manure. So this is cover crops. These are green manure crops. These are things that we are going to grow and then till into the soil, chop and drop, flail mow, harrow in. Some people are tilling it in, like Jean-Martin Fortier, tilling it in and then covering their soil to really heat it up and compost it super fast in situ. And so it's really, really powerful. And I think, like polycultures, if you have those cover crops and green manure crops built in, they're holding place and they're blocking those weeds, holding the space that the weeds would occupy. We'll talk more about that later. But those cover crops, you can actually chop and drop them and feed things in place. Some of them are kind of like take over everything and want to choke everything and cover everything. Like cowpeas. So you have to be wise and careful and monitor and all those sorts of things, but they're extremely powerful plants. Usually people use them in the off season because they're so vigorous and they're not going to be able to get those desirable crops that they normally eat and they get during those other growing seasons. So green manure can be extremely powerful. If you don't have a winter season or an off season that you can grow in, you grow in the buffers and the bumpers, and then you do something like Jean-Martin Fortier is doing, where he's covering things up to speed things up. And I don't think you necessarily need his, plastic tarps. I think there's plenty of things that we can create with canvas. We have plenty of histories of people creating really, really tight woven canvas. So we probably could use that to smother weeds and whatnot and have it be a biodegradable option that breaks down eventually. All right, so next is crops. So specific crops really build the soil. They give tons of carbon to the soil, and when you're done at the end of the season, you can return most of the plant to the soil. Actually, these crops are notorious currently for depleting the soil because we remove everything. So like hemp, they remove everything, but it could, do an amazing job of returning to the soil if we chopped and dropped it. Maybe just took the seeds and chopped the drop rest in situ. And then corn, it's the same thing. You take that seed and if you chop and drop everything in place, oh boy, there's a reason why its other cousins are being able to make syrup, and sugar out of the stalk. Another C4 grass would be sugar cane. Another one would be sorghum. Both those you can juice the stalk. And there is some academic belief that originally teosinte, we were chewing the stalks, the sweet stalks, when we weren't actually eating the seeds initially. So that is what started it. And then we started making beer with the seeds and stuff like that. So plants really can help build soil. Just look at cowpeas. They fix the most biomass and they fix the most nitrogen out of any other legume as a companion plant to corn. It's repeatedly been done in studies proving this. So some crops are all stars and they absolutely build soil, and we just got to steer towards those. And then compost. So this is the classic one, right? This is the decomposed organic matter that we're returning to the soil. So it says long carbon chains. It's full of life, and it is the building block for good soil. There's many different ways to do compost as well, and really there is one way to do hot compost if you want it to be like safe and well done and to get what you want. And so that is really simply getting your compost to heat between 131 and 140 for like about 15 days, and you're turning it a minimum of 5 times. And so what you're doing is you're heating it up, you're sterilizing it with thermophilic bacteria and fungi in this reaction where they're constantly consuming each other and they're constantly reproducing at that heat. Everything else is being cooked out. The pathogens are being killed, the parasitic eggs are being killed, and it's all aerobic because you're constantly turning it. And so that aerobic reaction is what keeps it safe, it keeps it sterile, and keeps the process going until it runs out of the fuel in the reaction, which is the nitrogen and the sugars and the green plants. When that runs out, it starts to cool. And so after you compost, you have to also let it cool, unless you're putting it on weeds hot to kill them. But compost is an unbelievable way to make more soil, because not only are you taking organic matter that would largely gas off and then turning it into rich humus, but when you put that humus in contact with dirt, it starts changing the dirt into humus and soil as well, because that's what it starts doing. The life starts working on it and changing it. So hot compost is ideal, is the best, because you get guaranteed results. You can then look at it under a microscope. You can expect a certain result. You can measure things. Mouldering is the cold compost that is just the passive composting. It's in the backyard, it's in a pit, it's just there, and you're just adding to it. And then some people wait a season, some people wait a year, but then they go in and get it. And so there's different times things have been added, different bugs and animals have been in it. There's a whole diversity of indigenous microorganisms there at different levels of decomposition. And because things aren't chopped up, things aren't made so there's tons of surface area, you might have pockets of anaerobic, pockets of aerobic. Mouldering is a terribly inexact way to create compost. And then you have vermicompost. So vermicompost is really cool because composting worms, red wigglers and other worms, they digest protozoa, nematodes. They're digesting those pathogens. They're not taking heavy metals and combining them into long carbon chains. They're not really digesting organic matter. They're digesting the life. So they're sterilizing it of the life, and it helps break the organic matter down too. But primarily they're digesting the life that is breaking down, and they're creating more surface area, which is creating more and more and more life. So their compost is very different. It is not brought through the same heat temperatures. It does different things, and we'll talk about what. And you've got to wait a certain amount of time. You've got to be careful about about how you do it, so that you're only taking worm castings and not decomposing food. So vermicomposting is a little bit more exact for sure, but it's a different product. And then compost, you're using manure, hot compost, you're using manure or some other high nitrogen source. There's no real reaction like that with the vermicompost other than what's going on in their gut. And we'll get back to their guts in just a little bit. But so these are the primary ways that people are composting. There is another way that often comes up in permaculture, which is the Champagne compost method. And Champagne is doing anaerobic piles and using the gas from the anaerobic piles to power his car or his van, to heat his house, to do the cooking. He's running water through his compost heaps that are getting so hot. They're giant compost, woody compost heaps. So it's just wood chips. And he's cleaning the brush off his site, and this is in France. And he's just building these giant piles. He's putting cones in the middle to capture the gas. He's having the gas come out, and he's running it through these inner tubes to cool it, and then he's using it. And so he's doing all this wild, crazy stuff with anaerobic, but at the end of the compost, he lets it go through fully so that after it's anaerobic, it starts to go aerobic because the surrounding area is aerobic. There's air, and that's what happens. It just happens over time. It eats up all the potential sugars, the nitrogen, all that, and then there's just carbon, and then there's nothing for the life to do, and all that life around it starts working on it, and you have it start to turn aerobic. It's always a process of anaerobic to aerobic, always, as we go through all these processes. I mean, there's not a moralistic thing here between aerobic and anaerobic. Let's just make sure there's that. We need to understand, though, that for plant roots, for human health, that aerobic soil microorganisms are ideal. And then whenever we're using anaerobic things, it is either edible or they're things that are going to happen and then pass and be digested. So they're not like, oh, well, that's always covered with anaerobes. And you know what I mean? It's it's a stage, it's a cycle that we're initiating when we're using any anaerobic microbes or microorganisms.